We are on the cusp of the 7th century, the 600s. This is an important turning point in the history of Ukrainian lands. And why? As we saw in our last lecture, by the middle of that century, circa 650, a new Turkic people from the east, the Khazars, arrive. The Khazars. And these Khazars establish what became a powerful political and in particular commercial center just east of Ukrainian territory between the lower Don, the lower Volga, and the Kuban region. And so if we look on this map, here is the present-day territory of Ukraine. The Khazar Kaganate, outlined by this shade, takes in much of central and eastern Ukraine, but in particular southern Russia, and the heart of the Khazar world is the lower Volga and the lower Don river valleys. The head of the Khazars, or one of their chief heads, was a Kagan, and hence we refer to the Khazar Kaganate. The Khazar Kaganate. The Khazar Kaganate reflected the nomadic lifestyle of its ruling elite. Trade and commerce were of the greatest concern to the Khazars, and so control and protection of trade routes that passed through Khazar territory was of the highest priority for the Kaganate's military forces. Khazar control was most effective in its administrative centers, we can say capitals, and certainly commercial centers. The first of these was a place called Itil, I-T-I-L, in the mouths of the Volga River. And the second of them was another one called Sarkel, S-A-R-K-E-L, in the lower Don. So here is really the heart of the Khazar Kaganate. Both these centers, Itil and Sarkel, great commercial hubs, linking trade routes from the Arab Caliphate in the south, across the Caucasus Mountains. They come up, and where do they go? They go into the heart of the Khazar Kaganate. And also southwest linking routes going to the Baltic Sea up in the north. The widespread discovery of now Arabic coins in Khazar territory, including Ukraine, attests to the influence of the Khazar Kaganate upon this area. And its influence, as we see, reached as far as the Dnieper River and even Kiev, which becomes a kind of outpost of the Khazar world. The main sources of revenue for the Khazar Kaganate consisted of customs duties levied on goods passing along trade routes under their control, taxes collected from peoples living under their hegemony. And what peoples were living there? Well, a whole host of them. There were the Volga Bulgars living up in the northern reaches of the Volga River, outside of, but still under their influence. And then some Slavic tribes, the Polyanians, living in the center of Ukraine, the Ulichians and the Tvertsians living in the southwest, the Vyatichians just outside of northern Ukraine. These are now all East Slavic groups. We're going to hear more about them. as well as eventually a group called the Magyars from the east, a Finno-Ugric people. So all of these kind of tribes somehow revolve around or are under the political influence of the Khazar Kaganate. Now, because of their interest in trade and commerce, the Khazars, somewhat in contrast to many of their nomadic predecessors, and for that matter, certainly successors, the Khazars preferred diplomacy and peace to waging war, thus, and plunder, better trade, not rob, for a good price. And so, in the north, even after those Volga Bulgars became independent, relations with the Khazars remained friendly. On the other hand, toward the south, after a fierce struggle with the Persian Empire and its successor, the Arab Caliphate, they had enough of fighting, settled on the Caucasus Mountains as a common boundary, and then trade back and forth from the Middle East to the Khazar world. Toward the west, the Khazars kept the Magyars and other Finno-Ugric tribes, and especially the Slavic tribes in the west of their world, in a kind of lord-vassal relationship. In return for these peoples paying taxes and tribute of various kinds, the Khazars provided peace, stability, and therefore possibilities for trade. Relations with the Byzantine Empire, that is the East Roman Empire, to the south, the major center of trade and civilization on the other side of the Black Sea, with its center in present-day Istanbul. Initially, those relations were also a little bit frayed. Why? Because of rivalry over control of Crimea. But that was finally settled, and the Khazars then signed treaties with Byzantium, and aside from treaties, used what we call marital diplomacy. Several Khazar princesses became wives of Byzantine emperors, and that helped to secure not only good political relations between the two powers, but also allowed for continued economic trade and mutual benefits in terms of that trade to both the Khazar Kaganate and the Byzantine Empire. These international commercial relations that were emphasized by the Khazars also transformed the realm into a fertile ground for cultural development. And here in particular, religion. The Khazars, like other nomadic peoples from the east, originally believers in shamanism, unseen gods and spirits, or demons, and that all of these were responsible to shamans, a priest or a priestess. But their ruling elite, led by the Khagans and their assistants called Beys, they became receptive to other, more advanced religions. And in fact, the Khazar Kaganate court accepted representatives of the three great religious traditions in the world in which they operated. And those three great religious traditions of the time were Islam. This they were introduced to by Arab traders already in the 7th century, again coming from the Arab Caliphate, from the south. They also accepted representatives of Judaism. This was via Jewish, quote-unquote, missionaries. And also accepted visitations from the Christian world, in particular via true missionaries from the Byzantine Empire, Cyril and Methodius, the same two who converted the Slavs. Actually, their first visit was to the Khazar Kaganate, where they spent close to 12 years. All of these religions and their representatives were received favorably by the Khazars. And interesting, sometime in the late 8th century, in the late 700s, the Khazar Kagan, the supreme ruler, and his immediate noble retinue embraced Judaism. Some also were influenced by Islam, but the leadership embraced Judaism, making the Khazar Kaganate the only state in history to have converted to Judaism, even if it was its elite, and even if it was only for a short period of time. But this has given rise to several legends in Jewish historiography in which Jewish authors try to prove that all of Eastern Europe's Jews are somehow descendants of the Khazars. Very famous popular book by Arthur Koestler after World War II called The Lost Tribe was one of the first to popularize that view. Now, from the standpoint of our discussion, the importance of the Khazars is that for two centuries, between 650 and roughly 850, the Khazar Kaganate fostered an atmosphere of stability within this wide region surrounded by several cultures between, as we can see, the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, and the Caucasus mountains. And while the Khazar Kaganate was never the kind of impenetrable bulwark of the steppe against the east, often suggested in traditional literature, nonetheless, it did serve as a power center around which nomadic tribes and federations, whether those be those vulgar Bulgars, later the Magyars, gravitated, and in which they found it more advantageous to trade and live in peace than to provoke war and conflict. This system of relative peace and prosperity, lasting for at least these 2 centuries, 650 to 850 on Ukrainian lands, north and east of the Black Sea, came to be known as the Khazar Order, or the Pax Khazarica. The Pax Khazarica. Now, within the shadow of this Pax Khazarica, the Slavic inhabitants in what is present-day central and southwestern Ukraine were able to move farther south along river routes as far as the Black Sea and to expand further east of the Dnieper River. And out of the old Antes Confederation, several distinct Slavic tribes evolved on Ukrainian territory. Some of them, like the Polyanians, the Vyatich, the Ulichians in particular, Severians, Derevlyanians, So here we have a whole host of now Slavic tribes that are consolidating themselves thanks to the peace and order created by the Pax Khazarica. Just like during the period of the Antis Confederation, the centers for these various Slavic tribes were those fortified hill forts, these Horodishchi or Horodi. At first they were no more than stockades encircled by moats, ramparts, where the surrounding agricultural population came for protection in times of danger. But eventually, these hill forts evolved into small towns where artisans produced wares and where merchants conducted trade. By the 9th century, by the 800s, there were about 400 of these hill forts just in the area of Kiev. 350 in Volhynia, 250 in Podolia, 100 in Galicia. So we're already getting settlements here. Among the more important of them were, of course, Kiev, Chernihiv, Przemyśl in the far west, places that you know from your successful test, map test. Now, initially, the tribal organization was in the hands of representatives of those families who had secured positions of power and influence because of whether wealth or military prowess or personal qualities. And these representatives met in a council, which was called a vice. This goes back to these early Slavic settlements, a kind of council in order to discuss and decide important issues. But soon those tribal leaders became actual princes. Now, as I've already mentioned, Ukrainian lands were an important trading component for the Khazar Kaganate. One major route connected, again, from the south, then from the far east, a route that went straight across Khazar territory to Kiev and on to Central Europe. Other routes ran south from the Baltic Sea, either through several lakes, and I have to then put this map up. From the North Sea, from the Baltic Sea, either down the Volga River, directly to the Volga and the Don, where the Khazars were, or directly south in this dark line, eventually crossing right through Kiev, Ukraine, to the capital of the Byzantine Empire. This dark line came to be known as the Great Waterway from the Varangians, that is the Scandinavian north, to the Greeks, that is the Byzantine Empire in the south. Along these routes, several smaller ones as well, the Slavic tribes in Ukraine exchanged their grain, wax, honey, sometimes fur and slaves, and in return, fine cloths, gold, silver objects, wine, advanced pottery. Living then within this protective shadow of the Pax Khazarica, the Slavic tribes in Ukraine were spared for a while the worst of the nomadic invasions from the east, thanks to the Khazar order. And as a result, they themselves were able to expand their agricultural and trading activities between the 7th and 9th centuries, that is 650 and 850. But these activities were dependent on a vassal-like relationship to the Khazar Kagans, to the Khazar leadership. And some of these new rising Slavic princes began to resent this relationship. The Slavs, however, were not united. No individual tribe had the strength to confront the Khazar Kaganate. Such strength only became possible in the mid-9th century, when a new development began in the region of Kiev. A development which combined the forces of the local region with a group of leaders from Scandinavia, from the north, and a group of leaders known as the Varangians. And as a result of the coming of the Varangians, a new consolidation or consolidated power came into being, known as the Rus. How did this new phenomenon arise? Or, to put it in the form of what subsequently became the famous and very controversial historiographical question, what was the origin of Rus?